kind cowboy saved a young Apache mother and her 3 children in a deadly snowstorm. Jake's boots crunched the thick snow as he rode his horse through the empty plains. The wind bit at his face, sending sharp chills down his spine. His horse, Dusty, huffed and shifted uneasily under him. The storm was coming, and it was going to be bad. Jake was no stranger to storms. He had seen many in his years as a cowboy on this distant planet. The weather in these parts was wild, unpredictable. But there was something different about this storm. It wasn't just the wind that howled through the air. It was the way the snow fell, thick and fast, like the planet itself was trying to swallow everything in its path. Jake squinted into the distance, trying to see beyond the endless white. He had been riding for hours looking for shelter before the worst of the storm hit, but the cold was closing in fast. He didn't know if he'd find a safe place in time. He adjusted his coat, pulling it tighter around his neck, and spurred Dusty on. As they rode, Jake's mind drifted. He had been on his own for longer than he cared to remember. Life had been harsh, and he had learned to survive by depending only on himself. His ranch, a small patch of land he worked on a distant corner of the colony, was nothing special. It was just enough to get by. But every year the winters seemed to get worse. The snowstorms came faster, stronger, and longer. Jake's thoughts were interrupted when Dusty suddenly reared back, pawing at the snow with his hooves. Jake pulled the reins, trying to steady the horse. That's when he saw it. A faint light through the thick snow, barely visible but unmistakable, a cabin. It was small, built out of logs, with smoke rising from the chimney. Maybe this'll be the break I need, Jake muttered to himself, guiding Dusty toward the cabin. He had been alone for so long that the idea of seeing another person was a welcome relief. Even if it was just for a little while, he could rest, warm up, and make sure the storm wouldn't trap him out here. When they reached the cabin, Jake noticed the door was slightly ajar. He dismounted, leaving Dusty tied to a nearby post, and approached carefully, knocking on the door with a fist. He waited, but there was no answer. The wind howled louder, almost as if it were pushing him inside. Jake pushed the door open, the wood creaking under his hand. Inside it was quiet. He stepped in, squinting through the dim light from the fire. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and something else, a scent he couldn't place. It was then that he saw her. A young woman sat by the fire, holding a bundle in her arms. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her hair was wild, tangled from days in the storm. She was thin, her skin pale from the cold, but there was something strong about her, something that told Jake she had been through a lot. At her feet sat 3 small children, huddled together for warmth. The smallest one, a boy no older than 5, looked up at Jake with big, frightened eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but was silenced by a stern look from his mother. The woman stood up slowly, still clutching the bundle. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Who are you?" Jake paused, unsure of what to say. His instincts told him to be cautious. He had learned that people weren't always as friendly as they seemed, but there was something in the woman's eyes that made him want to help. "My name's Jake," he said, his voice low but steady. "I was out in the storm and saw your cabin. I thought I'd stop and see if you needed help." She eyed him warily but nodded slightly. "I'm Kiona, and these are my children." Jake took in the small group before him. Kiona was young, maybe in her mid-20s, and her children were also different. 2 girls, about 8 and 10, and the small boy. They looked like they hadn't had much rest lately. The storm was only going to get worse, and Jake could see that they were all in trouble. "You're alone out here?" Jake asked, his gaze sweeping over the room. The cabin was sparse, with only a small fire and a few pieces of furniture. There was no sign of a man, no sign of anyone else. Kiona nodded. "My husband. He went out a few days ago to check on our cattle. He never came back." Jake's heart sank. He could see it in her eyes. The fear, the worry. She was alone with 3 children, stuck in a cabin in the middle of a storm with no way out. He couldn't just leave her here. "The storm's bad," Jake said quietly. "It's only going to get worse. You're not safe here. You need to come with me." Kiona shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "I can't. I have to wait for my husband to come back." He promised he'd return. "I can't leave." Jake took a step closer, his voice soft. "Listen, I know you want to wait for him. But if you stay here, you and your kids could freeze before the storm passes. I've been out in the cold for too long, and trust me, it's no place for anyone. I'll help you. We'll make it to safety." Kiona hesitated, her eyes flickering toward her children who were now watching them both. She looked back at Jake, her expression torn. The weight of her decision was clear. I don't know. I don't want to leave. What if he comes back?" Jake could feel the urgency in her words, but he also understood the struggle. She was scared and she didn't want to give up hope. but he knew the storm would give them that luxury.
Not this time.
He glanced out the door, watching the snow fall heavier and faster. I promise you I'll help you get somewhere safe. We can't wait much longer. The storm won't stop. Kiona finally nodded, her shoulders sagging with defeat. She walked over to her children and knelt down, whispering to them in her native language. The little ones looked confused, but they didn't argue. They could see the fear in their mother's eyes, and they trusted her, even when she had no answers. Jake stepped back, letting Kiona gather the children. He watched as they bundled up, each of them huddling together under a blanket, the fire flickering in the corner. He wasn't sure where they would go next, but he knew they had to leave this cabin behind. "We'll be all right," Jake murmured to himself. "We'll make it out." The storm was already closing in on them. There was no more time to waste. Jake looked back at the small cabin one last time. The storm had already begun to devour it, and the white snow quickly covered the tracks left by Dusty. He turned his attention to the small family that had joined him. Kiona, the young Apache mother, had gathered her children, and together they began the difficult trek across the snow-covered plains. The wind howled around them, pushing against their bodies like an unseen force. Jake walked at the front, leading the way, keeping an eye on Kiona and her children behind him. The oldest girl, a quiet child named Ayana, held her younger brother's hand tightly, while the other girl, Sika, clung to her mother's side. The smallest boy, who looked no older than 4, stumbled now and then, but Kiona gently urged him forward with soft words in her language. "You're doing good, little one," Jake said, his voice warm but firm, trying to encourage the boy, who looked up at him with wide eyes. He smiled, though it was hard to see through the snow and cold. The boy gave a small nod and kept walking. Kiona walked close to Jake, her face tight with worry. She had been quiet since they left the cabin, as if lost in thoughts that Jake knew were too painful to speak aloud. It didn't take long before they came across their first challenge. The path ahead was blocked by a thick wall of snow and ice, and they had to climb over it to continue. Jake stepped forward first, carefully testing the snow with his boots. "Stay close behind me," he ordered. "It's gonna be tough. Just follow my steps." Kiona nodded and carefully helped her children up the mound of snow. Wind picked up again, stinging their faces like needles. But Jake didn't stop. He kept moving, knowing they couldn't afford to waste any time. Every step was a struggle, but they pushed through, the snow up to their knees now, making each movement slow and exhausting. Dusty, Jake's horse, was a few steps behind, snorting into the air. The wind kept the temperature below freezing, and soon Jake's breath turned to vapor, freezing on his face and coat. Kiona's children were doing their best to keep up, but it was clear they were growing tired. Ayana, the oldest girl, looked like she was about to fall behind, but her mother quickly pulled her along, whispering words of encouragement. The youngest, the little boy, was shivering uncontrollably, his face pale under the layers of clothes. Jake stopped and turned to Kiona, his eyes filled with concern. "We need to find shelter. If we keep going like this, the cold will get us." Kiona nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. She had been through so much already, and the last thing she wanted was for her children to suffer any longer. But there was no choice. They had to survive. "There's a cave not far from here," Kiona said quietly. "I saw it when my husband and I traveled this way before." Jake gave her a quick look. "Lead the way," he said, his voice full of trust. He knew that she had lived on this land far longer than he had, and if she said there was a cave, he would follow her. They trudged forward, the snow thickening with each step. The wind howled louder, as if the world itself was angry at them for daring to cross it. Jake knew they were running out of time. If they didn't find shelter soon, the storm would claim them. As they walked, Jake kept his eyes on the children. Ayana had her head down, trying to shield her face from the biting wind, while Sika, the younger of the 2 girls, was clutching her mother tightly, trying to stay close. The little boy stumbled again, and Kiona quickly bent down, scooping him up and holding him close. "Don't worry," Kiona whispered to him, though Jake could see the worry in her eyes. "We'll make it." The snow began to fall harder, and the air grew even colder. It was as if the world was being swallowed by the storm. But then, after what felt like hours of walking, Kiona stopped, her head tilting toward the left. "There," she said, pointing to a distant rock formation. Jake looked ahead and saw what she meant. Nestled in the side of a small mountain was a narrow cave, just big enough for them to shelter in. Jake's heart lifted. It wasn't much, but it was their best chance at survival. They made their way toward the cave, each step heavier than the last. The snow was coming down so hard that it was almost impossible to see, but Kiona led the way without hesitation, her sure footing guiding them toward safety. When they finally reached the cave, Jake stepped inside first, making sure it was safe. The cave was small but solid, with enough space for them to sit and catch their breath. The walls were cold and damp, but at least they were out of the wind and snow. Jake turned to see Kiona helping her children inside, her face weary but determined. "Thank you," Kiona whispered, her voice barely audible above the howling wind outside. Jake nodded, giving her a small smile. "Don't mention it. We're in this together now." Kiona set the boy down by the cave wall and took a deep breath, her shoulders slumping. The children gathered around her, huddling together for warmth. She rubbed her son's arms gently, trying to warm him, but the chill had already settled deep into their bones. Jake knelt down beside them. "I'll get a fire going," he said. "It'll help. Just stay close." Kiona didn't argue. She and her children had been through so much already. She just nodded, and Jake quickly gathered some dry twigs and rocks. With a flick of his flint, a fire crackled to life, filling the cave with warmth and light. As the fire grew, Kiona's eyes softened. "You're not like the others," she said, her voice filled with a quiet sadness. "The others, they never helped." Jake didn't respond at first. He simply stared into the flames. He wasn't sure how to explain his actions. But he understood what she meant. The world they lived in was harsh, and kindness wasn't always something that came easily. But seeing Kiona and her children, seeing their struggle, had stirred something inside him. He couldn't just leave them out there to die. Kiona smiled faintly, her eyes softening with gratitude. "Thank you, Jake. You've saved us." Jake shook his head. "No need for thanks. We're just getting started. We've still got a long way to go." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but for now, they were safe. The warmth of the fire filled the cave, and for the first time in days, they all allowed themselves to rest. The fire crackled in the small cave, casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. The warmth was a welcome relief from the freezing cold that had gripped them for so long. Kiona, Jake, and the children huddled near the fire, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind howling like a beast, pushing snow in every direction. It felt as if the world outside was trying to swallow them whole. Jake sat closest to the fire, his eyes watching the storm through the narrow mouth of the cave. He knew they couldn't stay here forever. They had to move, but the storm was relentless. His mind raced, trying to figure out the best course of action. He glanced at Kiona, who was silently comforting her children. She was strong, but even Jake could see the exhaustion written on her face. It was clear that the last few days had taken a toll on her. "I'm going to check the trail outside," Jake said after a long silence, his voice breaking the quiet tension in the cave. Kiona looked up at him, her eyes filled with worry. "The storm's too strong, Jake. It's dangerous out there." Jake nodded, understanding her fear. He knew that the storm had already claimed many lives, and it could claim theirs if they weren't careful. But he couldn't just sit in the cave, waiting for the storm to pass. They needed a plan, and they needed to move. "I'll be careful," Jake reassured her, giving her a calm smile. "I'll just take a quick look around. We need to know what we're up against." Kiona hesitated, but finally nodded. She knew Jake was right, though the thought of him going back into the storm made her heart heavy. She wanted to protest, but she couldn't find the words. Instead, she silently pulled her children closer to her, wrapping them in the warmth of the blankets. Jake stepped out of the cave into the blizzard, the cold biting into his skin immediately. The wind howled in his ears, and the snow made it almost impossible to see more than a few feet in front of him. He pulled his coat tighter around himself, squinting against the snow as he walked slowly forward. He had to be careful. The storm had already made the ground unstable, and he didn't want to end up lost or worse. He took a few steps before the sound of something behind him caught his attention. He paused and listened, his instincts kicking in. The snow was too thick, the wind too loud, but there was something he couldn't quite place. It was a low growl, almost imperceptible beneath the roar of the storm, but it was there. Jake's hand instinctively moved to the pistol at his side. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew better than to take chances. His heart raced as the growl grew louder, and he realized with a start that it wasn't just one growl, it was several. A pack. Before he could react, a dark shape lunged from the snow, its eyes glowing in the dim light. It was a creature like nothing Jake had seen before, its body long and covered in thick white fur, with claws like knives. It was a beast born of the storm, a predator hunting in the blizzard. Jake drew his pistol quickly, aiming for the creature's head, but the snow and wind made it hard to see clearly. The creature lunged at him again, this time faster, and Jake had to roll to the side, narrowly avoiding its sharp claws. He fired once, twice, but the beast was fast, dodging the shots with surprising agility. Jake knew he couldn't keep up like this. The snow was making it impossible to get a clear shot, and the creatures, he realized there were more than one, were closing in fast. He needed to act quickly. He glanced back toward the cave where Kiana and her children were still hidden. He had to get back to them. He couldn't risk them being alone with the pack of wolves out here. He took a deep breath and fired again, hitting the nearest creature in the shoulder. It yelped in pain, but it didn't stop. Jake cursed under his breath as he backed away toward the cave. He had no choice but to lead them away from the shelter, or they would be trapped. The wolves were circling now, their growls growing louder, and Jake could feel the cold sweat on his brow despite the freezing weather. One of the wolves lunged forward, its jaws snapping just inches from Jake's leg. He kicked it away, stumbling back but managing to keep his footing. He fired once more, hitting the wolf in the leg, but it only slowed it down for a moment. With his heart pounding in his chest, Jake ran toward the cave. The wolves followed, their eyes fixed on him, hungry for the chase. He could hear their heavy footsteps crunching through the snow behind him, and he knew he didn't have much time. He reached the mouth of the cave and yelled, "Kiona! Get the kids!" "Move!" Kiona's eyes went wide with panic as she stood up, grabbing her children and pulling them back into the deeper part of the cave. "Jake!" she shouted, her voice filled with fear. "What's happening? What is it?" "Wolves," Jake called out, as he grabbed a large rock from the cave floor and threw it toward the mouth of the cave. He didn't have a choice but to fight back. He drew his pistol again, standing ready to defend the entrance. The wolves had arrived at the cave's mouth, and they began to circle, their eyes glowing like the burning coals in the fire. They growled, their sharp teeth visible in the dim light. Jake aimed his gun, his fingers shaking, but his determination remained firm. He fired once, hitting the nearest wolf in the chest. It collapsed with a howl, but the others didn't hesitate. They charged at him faster than he expected. He fired again, hitting one in the leg, but the others were getting closer. He looked back at Kiona and the children. "Stay inside! Keep away from the entrance!" he shouted, his voice desperate. Kiona grabbed her children, pulling them back into the farthest corner of the cave, her face pale with fear. She could hear the wolves outside, and she knew they were in grave danger. But Jake wasn't giving up. The battle raged on outside, and Jake fought with everything he had. He fired again and again, taking down one wolf after another. But the pack didn't retreat. They were relentless. Jake stood at the entrance of the cave, his heart pounding, sweat running down his face despite the cold. The wolves were circling around him, their growls filling the air. He had already taken down 2 of them, but the pack didn't show any signs of backing down. They were relentless, driven by hunger and the cold, and Jake knew that if he didn't act fast, they would overrun him. He couldn't waste any more bullets. He had just a few shots left, and he couldn't risk missing. The last thing he wanted was for Kiana and the children to witness what could be their end. "Stay back!" Jake shouted, his voice harsh as he fired another shot at one of the wolves. The creature yelped and stumbled back, but it quickly recovered. Its eyes locked on Jake. It wasn't going to stop. Inside the cave, Kiona had gathered her children close to her, trying to keep them calm despite the sounds of the battle outside. She could hear Jake's voice, desperate but determined, and it filled her with both fear and admiration. She had never met a man like him, someone willing to fight for their survival without hesitation. The smallest boy, the one who had been shivering earlier, looked up at his mother with wide eyes. "Mama, will Jake be okay?" he whispered. Kiana kissed his forehead gently, trying to stay strong for her children. "He's a brave man. He'll keep us safe," she whispered back, though in her heart she was not sure how much longer they could hold out. Jake had backed up into the cave entrance, his body tense and ready for the next wave of wolves. They were fast, their sharp teeth gleaming in the dim light of the cave, and the snow was making it harder to move. His legs were growing heavy, his muscles aching from the constant motion, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when Kiona and her children depended on him. He fired again, hitting one of the wolves in the shoulder. It went down with a sharp cry, but the others pressed on. Jake's mind raced as he scanned his surroundings. There had to be a way to outsmart them. But there was no time for a plan. The wolves were closing in too fast. Suddenly, something caught his eye. A faint light in the distance, flickering like a beacon of hope through the snow. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be? A settlement? Or at least a group of people? He didn't know for sure, but he couldn't waste the opportunity. The wolves, sensing his momentary distraction, lunged forward with a growl. Jake raised his gun and fired in a blur of motion. But then, just as the wolves were about to pounce, a loud, echoing sound rang out. It wasn't a gunshot. It was something else. A sudden blast of light cut through the blizzard, dazzling Jake for a moment. It was a beam of some kind, coming from the direction of the flickering light he had seen earlier. The wolves paused, their attention momentarily diverted, and Jake seized the opportunity. "Run!" he shouted to Kiona. "Go now." Kiona, who had been watching in horror from the cave's farthest corner, understood immediately. She grabbed her children and rushed toward the back of the cave, her heart racing. "Come on, children, stay close to me." Jake fired once more, his shot going wild, but it was enough to keep the pack at bay for a few precious seconds. He turned toward the light, his breath visible in the freezing air, and started moving toward it, hoping it was a sign of salvation. The wolves hesitated, sensing the change in the air, but they were still hunting. Jake's legs burned with every step, but he didn't stop. The light was getting brighter, closer, and he couldn't let it slip away. He reached the edge of the blizzard, and there, standing amidst the swirling snow, was a figure, a person, tall and strong, wearing armor that gleamed like metal, with a large rifle in their hands. The figure raised the rifle, and with a single shot, another wolf collapsed into the snow, its body tumbling lifelessly to the ground. Jake blinked, not quite believing what he was seeing. The figure in the snowstorm was not human, not in the way he understood. They had features that looked both familiar and otherworldly, pale skin, sharp eyes, and an air of quiet authority. They were an alien, someone from beyond the stars. "Are you—" Jake started, his voice rasping from the cold and the exertion. The alien figure nodded, their voice calm and firm. "I am Lyra. You're lucky we arrived when we did. These creatures are not native to this planet." Jake didn't have time to ask any more questions. The wolves were still circling, their eyes fixed on the new arrival. Lyra raised her rifle again and fired, sending another wolf sprawling to the ground. The remaining wolves hesitated, growling as they backed away. Lyra turned to Jake. "We need to move quickly." "There's a shelter nearby. It's safe." Jake didn't need to be told twice. He nodded and motioned toward the cave. "My friends are back there," he said. "They need help." Lyra didn't hesitate. "Lead the way." Jake quickly turned, running back toward the cave as fast as his legs would carry him. He could hear the sound of Lyra's footsteps behind him, but it was the light from her rifle and the strange hum of her energy weapon that gave him the strength to keep going. When they reached the cave, Kiona was waiting, her children gathered around her. She looked up with fear in her eyes, but when she saw Jake, her expression softened with relief. Then, as Lyra stepped into the cave, Kiona froze, her eyes wide with surprise. Who are you?" Kiona asked, her voice trembling. Lyra didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned to Jake. "Are they safe?" Jake nodded, his chest heaving with exhaustion. "For now, they're safe. Can we get them out of here?" Lyra nodded and motioned toward the back of the cave. "There's a shelter not far from here. I've already sent a signal to my people. Help will be here soon." Jake looked at Kiona, who still seemed unsure. "We'll get you out of this storm, Kiona," he said softly. "We're not alone anymore." Kiona's eyes softened, and for the first time since the storm began, she allowed herself to relax. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaky with gratitude. "Thank you for everything." Jake smiled faintly. "We're not done yet. Let's get out of here." With Lyra's help, they all left the cave and made their way toward the shelter, the storm beginning to subside behind them. The worst of it was over, and though the journey ahead was still uncertain, Jake knew they had a chance for survival, for hope. And as the storm finally began to quiet, Jake couldn't help but feel that the world, despite all its dangers, still had a way of offering light when it was needed most.